In this section, we're going to be covering some useful code examples, building some mini apps, and these are comprised of some of the most common questions that I get from students on how to do certain things within Google services and within the Google Apps script. So this includes how we can create charts in Google Spreadsheets, so we can set up those charts within the spreadsheets, also add charts using script to slides and create a slides presentation from the charts within the spreadsheets, and creating a PDF on the drive that we can also email out as an attachment, all from the slides file that we just created from the spreadsheets. So connecting multiple Google Apps services together to produce some really nice advanced functionality. Also with the Docs UI menu, how to create more interactive UI options and running scripts and codes. The Sheets UI menu, how we can track, edit, and change. So some of the simple triggers, such as the edit and change, whenever anyone edits any of the cells, how we can retrieve that information back. And also how, when their selection changes within the Google Spreadsheets, how we can track that with a simple trigger. There's also web apps for simple triggers, the onGet and onPost, how to make use of those, how to create web apps, and then also setting up automation. So we can set up triggers with script, and as well we can set up triggers manually. So they allow us to run code on events and also select time intervals to run code. So all of this is coming up in the upcoming lessons. Let's get started. Hey, in this lesson we're going to be creating a spreadsheet, populate some data into the spreadsheet, and then add and create a chart, all using Google Apps script. So let's go ahead and create a script. So under more, I'm just in my Google account logged in, going over to Drive, and then from the Drive I've selected to create an app script. You can also go to script.google.com and create a script from there. So this is going to be our tester script, and just give it a name of tester script, as we'll use it for a few different types of functions. So the first thing that we want it to do is create a spreadsheet. So let's create a function and make a sheet. And we want to return back within the log the ID of the sheet. And then we'll populate some data into the sheet. And then we're going to add in a chart, all using Google Script. So the first thing we want to do is create a sheet object. So using the spreadsheet app, and just create. And let's create a brand new spreadsheet. And for this spreadsheet, we'll give it a name of test sheet 1. And I'm going to call it SS. And then for the sheet object, we'll generate a brand new sheet. And so selecting to insert a sheet. So we'll insert a sheet, and this is going to be our chart sheet. And then within this sheet, we want to populate some information, some data into the sheet. So let's go ahead and add in some data into the sheet, and we can do that with a for loop. So let's set that up and let I equals 0, and we'll loop while I is less than. We'll add in 12 columns of data and then increase it. So within the sheet, we want to append a row, and actually the first row that we want to append, so the first row that we're appending is going to actually be the data that we want to append. So this is going to be the heading data for our chart. So we're going to want for the first column to be date, and then for the second column it'll be team A, and for the third column it'll be team B. And we're going to chart out their scores and the dates that they played the games. So we'll loop through, and we can actually probably increase this to about 20. And yeah, this is going to be just dummy content that we're generating. So we need to generate a starting point. So using the date object, let's generate the today's date within a date object, and then we can count number of days from this current object. So let's generate a value for the date using milliseconds. So 1000 milliseconds times 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 24 hours, and that's going to return back a value for a day. So that's going to represent the number of milliseconds in a day, and if we're getting the date object and returning back the milliseconds of the today's date, then that means that we can make a calculation for a future date. So let's set up some variables here, and this can be the date the game was played or something like that, and setting up a new date object. And this has to align with what we are appending our sheet headings with. So we've got a value of date for the sheet heading, team A and team B. So these are going to be scores, and the date is just going to be a date object. So let's use the today as our starting point, and we're going to get the time from today in milliseconds, and then let's add to that. So we've got some values that we can add to it, and we're going to do 100 times day to put us 100 days in the future off of today. And then we can also add I times 3 times day. So that should return back a 3-day interval for the data that we're generating. So we're multiplying 100 times days, so that's going to give us 100 days in the future. So whatever the calculation of 100 times this amount of milliseconds will put us into the future 100 days, and then I times 3 times day, and that's going to put us whatever number of milliseconds ahead or days, 3 days ahead. And we're multiplying the I times 3 times day. So the first value is going to be 0 times 3, which is 0, times day, which is going to be 0. But we're going to start out at the 100-day mark, and then we're going to increase 3 days after that. So let's also create a score, and using, again, JavaScript, and this is the math method, so we'll do a math floor. So these are just random dummy data. And of course, you probably want to use some real data, but just to practice, and actually I'm going to use math random method, so the curly brackets to invoke the method, and let's do it times 20. So it doesn't, again, really matter. It's just data to populate some content into a spreadsheet that we're generating, and so that way we've got some data that we can generate a sheet from. So appending a row and generating a chart from within the sheet. And we're going to append the row with date played value, with score 1 value, and with score 2 value. So that's going to populate the array, and that's going to be in line with what we've got within the headings, where we've got date, team A, and team B. And so this will give us a nice number of values to chart, and then we can also use the left side as the date to kind of progress through the chart, and then also we're going to have two different charts charting team A and team B. So adding all of that into the spreadsheet. And we also know with sheets, by default, they're going to create a sheet called sheet 1. So let's select that sheet 1 object, and we're going to remove it from our spreadsheet, so that at the end of the day, we're only going to have the one spreadsheet. So get sheet by name, and we're going to select the sheet 1 object. So it's going to return back that sheet 1, and then we'll take the spreadsheet object and delete a sheet, and the sheet that we're going to remove is the one that's called contained within the remover object. So going through this, it's going to create a brand new sheet with the name test sheet 1. Then we're going to insert a sheet into it with chart, the name of chart, and then appending a row. And this is going to be headings for the row. So date, team A, and team B are going to be the headings for the columns. Then creating a starting point for a date, as we want to track the chart along a date. And then also a day value, so that we can multiply it here and the code looks cleaner essentially. And of course you can work out what this end value is, and you can use that number as well. I usually typically like to break it apart like this, because then it's really easy to see, and the numbers can also be adjusted a lot easier. For the for loop, we can generate whatever number of values we want. So in this case, we'll just go with 20 for our chart. We're tracking 3 different values, and these are all values that are going into the columns. So we're generating a day, 100 days away and 3 days apart consecutively. Score, so just getting some random scores that we can add to the spreadsheet, and then appending the row, so adding the data to the spreadsheet. We're selecting the default sheet that gets created with the sheet, and then we're deleting it using the remover. And then lastly here within the logger log, we're going to get the spreadsheet and get the ID of the spreadsheet. So get So select the spreadsheet object and get ID of the spreadsheet object. And this will allow us to then use the ID within the next script, the next function, in order to create the chart. So let's generate the sheet. And going into the drive, and as soon as this finishes executing, we also do need to accept permissions if we haven't accepted permissions. So there we've got our ID generated, and we can use that in the next function, make chart function. And this is going to be the first value here because we need to select the sheet that we've just created, so the spreadsheet that we've just created, as we're going to be interacting with that. So log the ID, and of course you can always get it from the URL. So there's our spreadsheet that we created. Let's check the data. So we do have a date somewhere in the future here. Well, future for me while I'm recording this, and then it's generating a random time which we can use to chart out, and then also we've got some values there. So everything looks good, and if you didn't grab the ID from the log, you can always grab it from the web URL. It's going to be the same. So once you've set up your sheet, we're ready to create a chart out of that sheet. So we want to select whatever this sheet object is and get the value, and selecting the sheet data that we want to select as the range. And then we're going to insert the sheet chart into the spreadsheet. So let's select the spreadsheet object using the spreadsheet app, and then open by ID using the ID value that we just saved. And usually for this one, let's log out just to make sure that we have the spreadsheet object, where we'll log out and we'll run the make the chart. So we've do have the spreadsheet object, and we're going to continue with the building of this application come up in the next lesson, where we're going to be looking at part 2 of making the chart in the spreadsheet. This lesson is going to be a continuation from the last one, where we're going to continue to build out a chart and create a chart within the sheet. We want to get our range from the spreadsheet. So let's select our range for the chart. And we can just call this our range. And using the sheet, and actually we do need to select a sheet as well. So sheet, and using the spreadsheet object, and get sheet by name. So we know the name of the sheet. That's the same one that we've set up here. So we did create a sheet called chart. So we'll log that and select that spreadsheet. And so now we should have a sheet object. So within the sheet, we can get the data range. So that will get all of the data that's currently contained within the sheet. And then we can use that in order to generate a chart. So for the chart, we can set up some parameters within the chart. So let's set up the parameters for the H-axis. And the parameters that we're going to be using, this is going to be within an object. So there's a number of options here. Let's select the grid lines, and we're going to select how many grid lines that we want. The number of grid lines is going to be related to how many rows we have, as we're using it but via the rows. So the grid lines value this is also expecting an object, so we're going to set the count to be 20 for the grid lines. And then also let's create the chart object, and we're going to create a line chart. So first we'll create a temporary object, and then we'll use that to generate the chart. So using the sheet object, and then new chart method, and then we want to get the chart. So what type of chart do we want to get? And we want to do a line chart, as it's going to probably serve the purpose the best here. So you can select from any one of the charts. And then let's create the actual chart object. So this is going to be the actual chart object, and it's going to use temp. First thing we want to do is add a range value. So the range is going to be coming from the data range that we've selected up here, and that's the whole range value that we've got. So we also want to set a position, and the position is going to be where sets the position of changing where the chart appears on the sheet. So we need to have 4 parameters here, and that's the anchor row position, the anchor column position, the offset X, and the offset Y value. So offset off of those positions. So it requires all 4 of those parameters to set the position. So wherever we want to set the chart, and let's look at the anchor row position. So how about we set it at 3, and then the anchor column position can be 5. So we'll set to 3, 5, and we'll just set the offsets to be 0. They do have an example here of where we're adding the range, setting the position, and then we can build the chart. Also selecting of the chart type, so the range. So they do have some good examples here of how to build and create the chart. So those are the two functions that you definitely need. You can also set the axis option, and that's another one that's useful, and we've already set the axis grid lines there, so we can set that as an option and then use the axis value for the h-axis object as a parameter. So set the h-axis, and we'll just use the h-axis object for that parameter, and actually this should be comma. That's setting those 2 properties there. And I'll just move these to separate lines. It's a little bit easier there to read that. And then the last one is going to be to set to build. So it's going to run the build method, and that's going to actually generate the chart object. So now that we've generated the chart object, we want to insert it into the sheet. So we select the sheet where we want to insert it into, and select the insert chart. And then from here we can just select the chart object and add it onto the sheet. So now we've got the make chart, so let's run that and take a look and see what that generates. So that generates a chart, and I know that the date values here with all of the extra zeros there, so that doesn't look that great. But of course, if you were actually creating a chart, you would be able to better set that up and make it look a lot more readable. So there's also an option to set the headers for that as well, for the chart that we're creating. So let's set the number of, or it should be set num headers. So that's the one that's there above. So this method will allow us to set the headers for it, and it'll slightly make the chart more readable. So let's see what that generates, and it will give us the heading information that we have here. So team A and team B automatically will get populated there, and this is coming from the headers of the sheet columns. So that's how you can generate the charts within the spreadsheets. So go ahead and try it, and you can also update some of these numbers to have different options. So if we want to have grid lines count at 10 and generate the chart. So what happened here is that we've got the grid lines, so they're set to count at 10. So you don't have to always have them in line with all of the different pieces of data, although like your chart will look better if you do have the grid lines on those exact points. But of course you can add as many grid lines or remove the grid lines as needed. In this lesson, we are going to continue to build on and select the charts that we've just generated within the spreadsheet. So we do have a few charts that we've generated. And how about we generate one more chart? So I'm going to update the position, the row position, and save and run the code again. So that should give us a few charts to work with. So now that we've got a few charts within our spreadsheet, we might want to output them into a slides presentation. So let's do that in this lesson. where we're going to create slides with the chart data coming from the spreadsheet. And we'll call it Slides Maker. So again, we need to select the ID and select the sheet, and we can also get the sheet by ID. So that's going to select the sheet that we want to use. And now we want to select all of the get all of the charts within the sheet object. So let's create a variable called charts and then get the charts from the sheet. So this is going to return back an array of, and we can see this within the log. So but we log out what we've got for charts and save. So let's hit the slide maker. So we see we've got actually 4 charts that are sitting within the sheet. So I know there's some overlap here, and looks like we generated a few extra ones. So you can move these around and you can see them. So it actually doesn't matter where they are as long as they're on the sheet. We can select them within the charts object. And because we can select them, we can also create slides from them, so we can loop through them. So let's first create our presentation. So our slides object, and creating that using the slides app, and then create. So we want to create a presentation. We can also just get the sheet name as well. We already know the name, but let's get the sheet name dynamically. So that's going to return back, and we already know that it's chart, but in case we don't, if you want to get the sheet name dynamically, and always best case scenario is to build your applications as flexible as possible. So if you do change the sheet name, and if you're getting just whatever the first sheet is or something like that, then you can generate that and get the sheet name. So in this case, we're going to be creating the slides presentation from this particular sheet. So let's loop through the charts object and use for each to loop through each chart. And as we loop through, we can select the slides presentation and append a new slide. So let's create our new slide and use slides and append a slide. So that will give us a slide to add the content to. And within the new slide, we have an option here to insert sheets chart. So we can also insert it as an image. So we're going to go ahead and insert the sheets chart. And we'll just double click this. So it does require some parameters. So we need to specify the chart object that we're inserting. And then so this is the embedded chart. So we saw that when we listed them out in the log, that there's 4 embedded charts. So the numbers that we need to include here are where we want the position from the left and the top, as well as the size, the height, and the width. So those are the 5 parameters that you need within this method. This one's quite a bit. So let's add those in, and these are all going to be numeric values. So we can do left and top 0, and we'll do width 200 and 200. So 0, 0, and 200 and 200. So we're inserting the slides into the presentation. And let's save that. And run the slide makers. We need to accept permissions once again, as we're using a new script service, and that's going to be to view and manage Google Slides presentations. So we're accepting the slides permissions for the application. So we've got the 4 embedded charts. And we saw within the example where we insert the sheet chart that we just need the embedded chart object to insert into the slides presentation. So now we've created a brand new slide presentation. and it's got the chart data. So you might ideally also want to make it bigger, and then you also might want to remove the first slide within the slide object by default, or you can select it and add some text into it. So within the slides, we can get the slides, and that's going to return back all of the slides that are currently within the presentation. If we want to select the first one, which is the default one, we've got a number of options. So we can insert a chart there, we can insert table, we can insert text box, we can get the background color, we can get the elements as well. So that's another option, that we can get the page elements. So how about we return back the page elements, and then within the page elements, what we can do is then we can update those elements. So just we'll list them all out, and then for the elements we can use for each, and we can loop through them. So if we actually just want to update the first one, we can do the same thing where we did the get slides, and we can use the index value and select the first page element, and then update the first page element on the page. So selecting the element, or if we want, we can also remove them. So how about we just remove out all of the page elements, and then within the slides we can add in a new page element. So we'll do that, and then we'll add in, so we'll insert a text box, and within the text box we can write a welcome to the charts. So that will remove out what we have in the first slide, or you could just completely remove the slide as entirely and add in a new slide. So it's up to you, however you want to handle this. And in this case, we're going to insert a text box. So we're moving out all of the current elements, and then we're inserting a text box. And also we wanted to make an adjustment on this because these presentations turned out very small. So maybe we want to add in some spacing around them, and probably want to make them quite a bit bigger. So let's try a 300 by 400 size and see how that works. So run it, and we'll check out the next sheet or the next slides that gets made, and take a look at that. So give it a second to load. So now the charts are bigger, probably again not as 100% as ideal as maybe you want. You might want to center them more, make them even bigger. They do look like they've been moved down quite a bit. And even this welcome message, we probably should set some sizing for that as well. So there's a few things that we can still do here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the size of this to be bigger, and also we'll move it back up. So we'll get rid of the top position of 50 and change that to 10 for the top position. And then also let's resize these. And actually we want the width to be wider than the height. So save and try that one more time and see what size we end up with. So there's our new chart. And that time it turned out to be too big. So yeah, you do have to do a little bit of trial and error about how big your charts are, and then how much space you have to work with. So let's set the width to 600 by 400, and we'll also remove out some of the padding there at the side. And try that one more time. And we can just remove out these previous ones. So this looks pretty good. So now we've effectively created a slides presentation from the charts we had within our spreadsheet that we generated in the earlier lessons. So coming up next, we'll do some more stuff with the slides presentation that we've just created. So that's coming up in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be selecting a slides presentation and generating a PDF of it onto our drive. So we saw in the earlier lesson how we can generate a slides presentation. So let's create a function, and we can just call this make a PDF. So we're going to take some files and we're going to make a PDF of it. So let's select the ID of the file that we want to generate the PDF from, and we're going to use the slide presentation. And so use that ID, and then selecting within the Drive app. So we're going to create, and this will just be the old file. So using the Drive app, get the file by ID, and then specify the ID value. And then within the logger log, let's see what we've got for the old file, just to make sure that we have selected something. So select make a PDF, and we are going to have to accept permissions because we're accessing additional services within the G Suite. So we need to make sure that we are accepting the permissions, that we can see and download all your Google Drive files. So that's the permission that we're accepting in this case for this application. And we're just checking to make sure that we've got the file and what we've got within the log. And this is just using the Drive app service and the get file by ID method, where we've specified the ID of the file, and that came from the web URL where we've got the file presentation ID here as an ID value. So that makes it easy to make that selection of the file. And we'll try to run that one more time. I'm not sure why that was taking so long. So we need to make a PDF, and so we've got the file here that we've selected. And once we've selected the file, we can get things like we can get the name of the file as well. So we can run that and we can get the name. So it's just got the name chart, and it's just outputting that within the log. So it outputs it by the file name. So what we need in order to generate a PDF is to turn it within a blob format. So taking the old file and then use the get blob method. And what this is going to do is it's going to turn it into a blob format. And the blob format is kind of that flexible format that you can take whatever file and then you can do a bunch of stuff with it. So if we're getting it within a blob format, then we can generate a PDF. So let's create a brand new PDF file and use first we'll create a file object. So using the Drive app service again, and then create file, and creating a file from a blob source. So once you have it within a blob, it's fairly easy and straightforward to create a file out of it, because then we just use the blob object there to create the blob source for the file. And then once we have it as a file, then we can take the file, we can set a name for the file. And because this is going to be a PDF, or it's going to be slides, just call it slides tester, or we want to create a PDF out of it. And then use the Drive app, and we'll create a file from it on the drive. And the file that we're going to generate, again, it's going to be looking for the blob source. So we're generating a PDF from it. And that means the value of the PDF should be a blob. So let's make an update on that. So before that, let's run the code and see what happens. And it's going to throw an error here. And then we'll take a closer look at what we've got in the drive, and we'll make some more updates to this. So right now we're generating some files. We need to, again, accept the permissions. So go through the permissions, accept the permissions for the app, and then we'll check out what we get created on the drive. So there's our error that we threw, so let's update it. And I was actually trying to access something. So we did create the PDF called Slides Tester. So that's the PDF there. And you can also get this as a PDF file. So you can create it from a blob, or we can convert the file into a PDF and then create it from a PDF format. So this can, maybe I'll just rename this to file2, and then we'll create our PDF object. So the PDF is going to be generated from the file object. So we'll take the file and get as, and get as will force it to a specific file type. So in this case, it was able to detect that it is a PDF and to generate it accordingly as a PDF. But in some cases, it might not be as evident what type of file you want to create. So let's create using the application PDF. So set the type of file that we're getting, and this is going to generate a PDF as well. So let's run, and we'll generate a second PDF. And I did have a spelling mistake here. So save. So let's make the PDF. And going into the drive. So when we created the file, the second one that we made, the slides tester, so this one ended up having the extension of PDF, whereas the other one was just assumed as a PDF. So it didn't end up with the extension PDF because we forced it to be a PDF. So let's actually set a different file name and set name so that we can distinguish between the two files that are getting created. And I'll delete the previous ones, and we'll run through it one more time. So it's going to generate the two files. So one is from a blob, and it's just generating as a file on the server. So it's detecting it as a PDF. The second one is creating it as a PDF, so it's getting the file first. So selecting the file from the drive as a blob, and then it's forcing it to be a PDF, and it's creating a file from the PDF format. So that saves it as a PDF. So this is an example of the PDF, and we can open up the second one as well. So we've got the two PDFs that are generated on the drive. So you can do either way when you're generating the files. So creating it from a blob and let Google decide what type of file it is, or you can get the blob as a PDF and make sure that it is a PDF. So one more thing before we conclude, if you want to email out the PDF, so let's say you want to email it to yourself. So let's grab our email address and using the session and get the active user. So get the active user, and then we'll get the email address. So we want to send ourselves this as an attachment, as a PDF attachment. So taking the file object, and we're going to send it as an attachment. So selecting the send email. We don't need the Gmail app service as we're just sending a regular email. So we've got the email and PDF attached. And then for the body, we're going to do that as an object. And then within the object of the send mail, we're going to specify attachments. And let's select the file object and get as. And we're going to specify the meme type as PDF. And then comma separated, and we have another opportunity to set a name for the email. And we'll just give it a name of attach PDF. And save this. And you can also use it as application PDF as well. So setting the type as application PDF. So this ensures that this is sending a PDF to the email. So let's run this, and we're going to generate the PDF and send it over as an email attachment. So we need to accept some more permissions, send email as you. So let's go ahead and allow that. And let the script run through. Then we'll check our inbox to make sure that we've got the file as a PDF within the inbox. So go over to the Gmail. And within the Gmail, so there's our email, so PDF attached. And within the slides tester PDF, we can open up the file as an attachment. We can add it and save it to, we can download it, and then we can also add it to our drive. And then let's take a look and see what we've generated. So we still generated the 2 files on the drive. So that's a number of things that you can do once you've got a file. And you can also, if you wanted to send a sheet as a PDF, you can just update the ID here, and we'll run through it and we'll make another PDF. And this time we're going to use the spreadsheet. And all you need is the ID of the file. So once that finishes running, we still have the same names that we're using, but it's generated as a PDF from the contents of the spreadsheet. So as long as you've got it within the blob format, it'll generate the PDF. And same thing, we've got the sheet as a PDF here that we can look at. So that's all possible, and that's how you can create PDFs from any file ID from your Google Drive. And also save them as PDFs on your drive and email them as attachments. Log into your Google account and go over to the drive, and let's create a brand new document. And this document's going to be a bound script that we're going to be using in order to test some of the functionality with Google Apps Script, including adding a UI menu and then testing out showing dialog boxes and sidebars. So let's call it UI tester. And then under the tools, go down to the script editor, and that will open up the editor for the script so that we can begin creating and writing some script code in order to add to the UI. And I'm also going to rename this to match with what we've got for the document, so that if I am looking for this particular application in my projects within the script.google.com, I can always find it fairly easily. So with the UI, you have an option to set it up whenever the doc opens. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be using the default function that runs automatically whenever the doc opens. So whenever any user comes and opens the document, it's automatically going to kick off the onOpen function. So this function is going to run in the background, and we want to select whatever the active document is. So using the variables and setting up the doc using the document app class, we can get the active document. So it's going to return back the current document that is using the functionality. And within the doc itself, we can add some content. So we can do the document body, where we're getting the body object. And then within here, we can append a paragraph. And this paragraph can contain some information, so we can generate the date. Every time the user opens up the document, we can generate a date object. And also we can separate this out, and we can give it a variable name of new content and pull it out, and then reference when we're appending a paragraph to the body object, it's expecting some type of content here, and we can specify this content within the paragraph. So we will have to accept permissions. So I'm going to run the function on its own, just do a run of the function. It's going to ask us to authorize the app to accept the permissions of the app. And let's go ahead and go through the permissions, allowing the app to view and manage the Google Docs documents. So once you've accepted the permissions, the script will run through. Append paragraph is actually expecting a string value, and we're passing in a date object. And we see that we do get an error here that says that the parameters don't match the expected method. So this is expecting the content as text. So if we were to convert this into a string, then we are able to post it into the append paragraph, because this in fact is actually expecting a string value. So if we were to turn the function name into the string, we run the onOpen, and that will execute fine. So it is expecting a string parameter there. So we need to turn the date object into a string. And we can do that by wrapping it with the string method and forcing this to return back as a string value. And that way we can post it into the append paragraph. So now let's try it one more time. And we execute properly, and we do get the time and date object written as a string when we do open the document. So let's try it in real time, where we're going to refresh the doc and I'll clear out the content within the doc. And that means that every time we open the document, we should track the date of the current opening of the document within the document. So just let the script run, and there's our code that we're adding into the doc every time we're opening it. And we're actually going to do one more thing before we conclude this. You notice that within the onOpen, we're passing an event object. So if we want to get event details, we can convert this into a string, but we can also use the JSON stringify method and take the event object and convert it into a string. And that way we can pass in the event details into the paragraph. So let's save and run the onOpen and see what we get added. So we don't get anything because there aren't any current event object details. If you log it out into the log and we run the onOpen function, you're going to see that we're returning back null, and that's why we're not outputting any content there. So these event or parameter that we're picking it up within the onOpen function, which is actually going to be a trigger that you can run on docs, sheets, slides, forms files. So this actually is a function that picks up the event object that is passed to the function, and this object contains information about the context that caused the trigger to fire. So you can use it optionally, so you don't have to pass in, and if you're not expecting any values such as what we saw within this case, then we're not going to see anything when we try to log that information out. So let's try one more thing, and we just make sure we save it, and we're going to run the onOpen trigger on its own. So running that trigger, and we'll see if we get any content being output. And in this case, we actually did get some content being output. So we see that the event object is passing in information such as the source, author mode, and the author mode value there, the user, so it's got the email and the nickname. So it's not picking up that information, but if it is, then if there is information within the event object, then you can pick that up and you can use it within your code. So going back into our script, our bound script for the file, we're going to comment out all of this information, and we're going to simply select the UI menu and add to the UI. So using the document app, let's get the UI object. And once we've got the UI object, that allows us to interact with the UI. So we can add in the UI menu items. So selecting the UI object, we've got an option to create the add-on menu, or we can just create a menu on its own. So you do have two options here. So if you select the create the add-on menu, and I'll also show you the create menu option. So you do have two options to create menus within the UI. That's going to allow you to add to the UI the menu items. So we're creating an add-on menu item, and then let's add items to the menu. So giving the item, and it's expecting a caption. So this is the value that the user is going to be able to see within their UI menu, and whatever you want the user to be able to see. And then you need to comma separate it out and also have a string value for the function that you want to run. So just call it fun1. And you can add as many items as you want. You can construct the menu, add in breaks between the menu as well. So let's add a couple items here. And then we need to create the corresponding functions. So fun1, and then we'll do one more for fun function and fun2. And then we should also have something happening within the function code. So let's select the document body and get the body, actually get the document body. And then that's going to allow us to write to the document. So we can also select the whole body and get it as text, and then we can append or insert the text to it. So let's create an object to contain this, and we'll just call it text, and selecting the document body object, and then edit as text will allow us to edit that content as text. So that way we can take the text and do an insert text, and then where we want to insert, so where the offset is for the text of the document. So I'm assuming that there is already some content within the document, so I'll start it at offset of 10, and then I'll call this just the new text. So it'll always offset at the position of 10. If we want to add a new line, we can also add a new line within the text format where we do the carriage return of backslash and then n, and that will add in a new line. And we can add in as many new lines as we need. So let's have that function for the first one. And then in the second one, we're going to add in a paragraph. So creating a brand new paragraph using the doc object. And then we've got option where we can append content. So we're going to be appending and adding a paragraph to it. So just go into where we've got all these options to append a paragraph. And then this is going to require a string value. So new paragraph. So just add in some string content there. And we're ready to go to add that to the menu. So now this function is going to run whenever we open up the document, and we still need to add to the UI. So that's the last function that you need, and that's going to actually add the object to the UI. So I can also run it just running the code itself, and we can run the code. Execution is complete, and that will add items to the menu. So you have two options when you're adding items to the UI menu. You can add it to the right of the help, or you can also go under the add-ons, and then within the add-ons you can select and run the scripts there. So wherever we're running it under the add-ons, we can run and we can run the various functions. So the other option as well is to create a menu item, and then using a typical menu item, that way you could add it to the menu itself. So let's do that as well, where we're going to create an add-on menu, but we're going to create the add-on menu within the top menu object. So let's do a second UI object, and we're going to add this one as a menu to the right of the help. And this method is the other one that we saw there, where we just do a create menu, and this will create a custom menu object. And then from here, the format's the same, where we can add items to it and save it. So let's run that function one more time. So now we've created a menu where it says, see, it says custom menu here to the right of the help. So we've got the same functionality there. And that's the two options that you have for creating the UI menus, where you can create one under the add-ons and then run the functions from there, or you can create it as a separate button in the top to the right of help, and whatever your preference is, you can run the functions and run the Google Apps script code that way. In this lesson, we are going to be working with Sheets and looking at some of the simple triggers that are available within the Sheets. So we saw on open and that we can create a UI menu within Docs. So Sheets have a few more simple triggers that you can utilize. And there are some restrictions that the scripts must be a bound script. So it can be Sheets, Slides, Docs, Forms, Files. And the add-on extends to any one of those applications. So let's we'll call it Sheets Tester. And then within the Sheets under the tool, let's open up the script editor. And also just to note as well that the simple triggers, they're not going to run in a read-only mode. So users that are accessing it with read-only mode, they're not going to be able to run the UI. So just give this a name. And also that these simple triggers, they can't run for longer than 30 seconds. And they're also subject to the AppScript trigger quota limits. So keep that in mind when you are creating the simple triggers. So we've seen that there's simple triggers, the do-get, do-post. So they allow us to create web apps. There's also the on-open that we saw last time within the docs. There's also an on-open within the Sheets as well. So let's update this and create the on-open. And within the on-open object, we're going to select the current sheet object. So select using spreadsheet app, and then get the active spreadsheet. And so once we've got the spreadsheet object, we can create some menu items that we want to use. So we can use this within an array format. So creating an array, and this can list out all of the object values that we want to add to the menu. So for instance, we've got 1 and these are going to be required property names. So if we want it to have an advanced menu, just something advanced. And then we need to pair that with what the function name is that we want to run. And so let's grab the function name, and we'll just do the same thing that we did last time. And I'll update this to say fun1. So once we want to add it to the menu, we can use the current spreadsheet object and use the add menu method. And then what do we want the string? So what do we want for the name of the menu? And this is where I'll add in the advanced. And then let's use the menu items object to add the items to the menu on open. So run the function and I'll see what happens. And probably going to have to accept permissions for this. So just taking a few seconds to accept the permissions. And this is just one way that we can add a menu. I'll show you a few other ways as well. So let's go through the permissions and allow the permissions then script to see, create, edit, delete your spreadsheets on your Google Drive. So it's allowing us to interact and update with the spreadsheet. So that added in the menu item there, and then we've got the fun1. And for this one, let's create a function so that it actually does something. And it'll just add a brand new row. So you get the spreadsheet app and get the active spreadsheet. And then we're also going to get the active sheet. And then within the spreadsheet, let's just do a simple append row method. And this is just going to add content. And then you could comma separate it out. So these are all of the different columns that you can add in. And let's save that. So now when we run the function, it's going to add content to the next available row. So it's just going to append a row. So we got the function running, appending a pair next rows. So there are also other ways to add the menu item to the spreadsheet, as well as we can fire off these events, the simple triggers on edit as well. So there's a number of other ones that we can also do an on selection change. So when the user runs, changes the selection of spreadsheet or edits the content within the spreadsheet, the sheets actually has a few other items. And also we can set it up the same way that we did the last lesson, where we can get the UI menu. So let's select the UI object, so spreadsheet app, and it also has this option to get UI. So this is going to allow us to construct the UI the same way as we did. So to create add-on menu, and this can just say new. And let's add the item. So give it the name that the user can see, the caption, and then the function that it's going to run. And then lastly, you can add separators as well if you want, and then add it to the UI. And actually, let me update this to create menu. So with the create add-on menu, that's the one that adds it within the add-on section. So that's why we've got the add-on. And that one doesn't require a string parameter. So if we run that, that's going to add that under the add-on menu. So we've got their function there. And if we want to add it into the top menu, just as we did originally, that's where we could use the create menu method. So let's do that as well. I'll take this out and comment it. And this one, we're going to do the create menu. And this one actually does require the string parameter. Save it, and let's run that. So we've updated and we've added a new menu item there. And notice the other ones are still there. So you can add multiple items here if you want as well. So you don't have to remove the initial script. But if you are adding menu items, it's usually best to just have it under one tab, but it's optional as well. You can add multiple tabs. So you can keep this code running and that code running, or you could run this two times to add two different UI menu item buttons. So let's select and set up some other triggers. And I'll also run the on open here, and we're going to select the active spreadsheet, and I'll log into the active spreadsheet. So actually, instead of creating a function, we'll create a logger function. that will take one parameter there as a value. And that's going to select the active spreadsheet, and it's going to append to the active spreadsheet whatever the value is that we're sending in. And in this case, we want to log out. So we'll use this new logger that we have, and this is going to take the JSON stringify of the event, and that will add it into the spreadsheet. And we're actually just going to log it into a logger sheet. So let's open up a new sheet, and we can give it a name of logger. And then within here, we're going to open the sheet. So we use get sheet by name, and then let's specify the name in a string value within the sheet, and we can try out the logger. And we're actually not going to log anything because there's nothing there. So just as we saw when we're running the onOpen, we're not actually passing an event object. But let's also try it when we refresh, and we'll see what happens. So we're running the onOpen simple trigger. That's adding the menu items, and there's our menu item. And then this is the event that ran. So we see we've got some more information here where we've got the column end, column start, and row start. So that's creating a range of whatever is actively selected, and that's running on the onOpen. So you have a range right off the bat when you're opening up the script. There's also the author mode source, and there's the user information here, but it's not passing it into the event object. So that's the information that gets passed in the event object. Let's open up the script editor. And the next lesson, we'll take a look at some of the other simple triggers that are available within the spreadsheet. So go ahead, try it out, add in the onOpen and add to the menu. And coming up, we're going to try out some other simple triggers in Sheets. Hey, in this lesson, we are going to be updating and creating some functionality. So demonstrating some functionality that's available within the simple triggers. And this is going to be available within the Sheets. So we've got a couple functions that we're going to be looking at, and one of them is if we are updating some cell contents, we're going to track that cell contents, turn the cell background to green, and there's also going to be a selection one. So also within the cell, we're going to be adding a note when it was updated and manipulated. So the other function that we're going to be building, and this one you can kind of see running here in the background, as well as we're going to be tracking the event object. So if you make a selection, and the number of cells that you select will determine the background color that the selected cells are going to change to. So looking at the simple trigger of the onSelection change and onEdit, and we're tracking some of the event object information directly within the sheet so that we can take a closer look at what information is being returned back in the event object, and then also making use of the range class and updating, manipulating the selected elements that are active within the range. In the previous lesson, we've been looking at the onOpen, which is a simple trigger. So trigger lets the app script run a function automatically when a certain event, such as opening a document or a sheet. Simple triggers are set to a set of functions built into app script. So such things as the doGet and the doPost, which we've seen within the web apps. So we're going to look at that as well in a little bit more detail as in the upcoming lessons. So within Sheets, there's a few other ones that we want to look at in this lesson, and that's looking at the onEdit and onSelection methods. So let's try that, and we're going to create the function trigger and using onEdit. So this is going to be one that runs when the user changes a value within the spreadsheet. So you can compare it and you can check to see what the user has updated, and we'll log out the event information. So taking the event information, we're just going to log it out to that same function, that logging function that we created the last time, where it logs content into the sheet. So let's take a look at this. And again, whenever the user updates and clicks off of the cell, let's see what happened here. So we do get some information there, and we've got the column end, column start, and row end, row start, and we've got the value of the cell. So that information is all logged and tracked. So we get the end value of the cell, we get the range of where it's located, and we can see what was updated. So you can also do things like set a node if you want as well. So we're picking up the range. So let's select the range. And we can get this from the E range. And this is again passed into the event object. So you've got some information there and you know what the range of the selected event is. And you also know what the cell value is as well. So you can select the range, and from that range you can use the set note that allows us to add a note to the selected range. And we can do something like updated. And let's also add in the date object. So updated, and then whatever the string value is for the date, we're going to add the note in. So let's try that out. And so we've got two actions that we've got within this function whenever it gets edited. So that's going to run whenever we click off of it. So notice that now I clicked off of it and we saw that we tracked that information. So we get the value, we've got the row information as well. So we can use all of that information. And then as well here there's a note that's been added to the cell where we've got the updated value that we can see. So the onEdit runs automatically when the user changes the value of any cell in the spreadsheet. So most of the onEdit triggers use the information from the event object to respond appropriately. For example, whenever we're selecting it, we can update some type of content that was edited. We can also update, and let's actually log out within the logger, let's pass some additional information into that sheet logger that we just created. So we can select the range. And now that we've got the range class, that allows us to get formulas, get fonts, get backgrounds, get styles, get all of that information that's available within the range. Let's just get the last row from the range. So get last row from the range value. And let's run that one more time. So updating some content, and that's going to return back the row value, which is 7 of the content that was updated. So you can get all of this information, and we've seen before that if we can get information, we can also set information. So once we've got the range, there's really a lot of stuff that we can do. So we can set the color, the background color, so using the set background, and specify the color value that we want to set. So using the hexadecimal values. So let's set that as the background color. So anything that gets edited now in the sheet, we're going to apply a background color. So there's that green background color. So anything that we select in the sheet and we edit. And of course, if we don't make any changes, it's not making any of the updates. So that's what you can do with the trigger, the onEdit trigger. There's also an onSelection trigger as well. So let's try that one out. So onSelection, and it's actually onSelection change. And you can also get the event object within the onSelection change. So let's select that. And what we'll do for now is we'll just log that out. So selection change, and this trigger runs automatically when the user changes the selection in a spreadsheet. Most of the triggers use information within the event object, just as we saw the E. So let's make a selection change and go back. So it's tracking these selection changes here. So you see we've got the selection change here, value. And actually let's log that out within an array format, so we can distinguish between the two. And try that one more time. So even if we're selecting from here, oops, it looks like we got an object there. So we need another way to log this. So let's do a second logger, we'll call it logger 2. And this one, the value is just going to be taking in the array values. So that way, when we pass in an array, we can add multiple rows. So try that one more time. So see, whenever we make the selection and then we click off the selection, what it's doing is it's tracking the information. We see we get the range of the selection. So that means that we can use that range of that selected content and we can do some updates to it. So how about we get the range, just as we did before, eRange object value. And within this range, so we can set the background color to the selection, or we can take the range and let's try setting a background color for the range that we selected and go out, try it one more time. So that's going to apply the background color to the range. So whenever we make a new selection, it's running the code and applying the background colors to the selection. Let's only apply this to ranges. So let's have a condition here that if the range, and just as we saw, we can get the last row. So we can also get number rows. So it's going to return back a string value and it'll tell us how many rows that we've selected. And I can pass that into our log. So let's just move the range down here. And then here we'll track in the number of rows. And there's also the number of columns as well that we can get. So number of columns. And if the number of rows plus the number of columns, so let's do a total here. And this is going to be for the bigger selections. We're not going to update the color. It's only for the smaller selections. And get number of columns. So it's going to be our total. And we'll do a condition to check if total is larger than, we'll say larger than 8 cells selected. Then we'll set this color. Else we'll set a different background color. So let's update this. And not sure what color that's going to end up being. So if we select larger values or larger number of cells, then the color is going to be different. So you see on the smaller selections, if we're getting less than 8 cells, it's turning it green, whereas if we're getting a larger selection, it's turning it this pink color. And we're tracking the number of selected rows and values there. So you can also track other information here into this object as well. So once we have the range, as mentioned, there's quite a bit of information that you can get from within the range class. So we can also get the font size. So but we get a few more items here. So get the font size. And with range, there's a lot of stuff that we can see. So the font size is 10. And we saw that if we can get it, we can also set it as well. How about we get the backgrounds? So get or select the range object and get backgrounds. And I'll see what that returns. So it's returning an object. So that means that we can JSON stringify it so that we can see the object, and we might have to iterate through it. Let's see if we can get it that way. And that way we ended up actually getting all of the background colors. So notice we got a multi-dimensional array with a ton of information in there. So we've got all of the background colors. So that's what we can do when we've got an object and we stringify it. And if this object is just an array object, then we can output that data. So when we are making the selection, this is going to be a larger size selection typically. So that's why a lot of the values are going to get returned back within the range. You have to look for the plurals on the values in order to make use of them. And then obviously once you've got them, you can make use of them as needed within the code. So those are some of the simple triggers that are available within the Sheets and the Spreadsheet app. Let's go over to script.google.com. We're going to create a standalone script, so a new project for this lesson. And this is going to be a web app. So web app simple trigger. And just give it a name, web app simple trigger. So we are going to be looking at the doGet method. So this runs when the user visits a web page or a program sends an HTTP request. So this is using the get method within the web app. And there's also a do post. So this runs when the HTTP object method is post instead of get. So those are two different methods that you can use. And you can actually use both of them at the same time. So we can select and return back content within the web app using these triggers. And they also do have the event object information that gets passed. So we can pick up some of those event parameters and make use of them. So let's go ahead and create a doGet and then create our web app. So running the doGet. And the doGet is the default method for that runs within the web browser. So your web browser is going to be running the doGet. We're going to select the event object and return back the parameters that are within the event object. So using the HTML service and creating just a simple HTML output. And that output is going to be coming from JSON stringify. And actually, if you like, you can create a separate variable for that, and that would just be creating the HTML content using JSON stringify, and we're going to generate that from the event object and output the HTML object here. So that's it, and that's just going to be returning back the event object and stringifying it so that we can see it as output content within the HTML service. So let's go ahead and we're going to run that, and we actually need to deploy a web app for this. So going up to deploy, hit new deployment in order to deploy a web app. And you need to select what type of web app. So there's a few different options here. So there's add-ons, which is what we're going to look at later on. There's a library and there's an API executable. So for the library, this allows you to create scripts, and then you can share the script source as a library to other app scripts and other app scripts that you're using. So the web app is the one that we're looking at, and this is my doGet tester. So you have a few options here, how you execute the web app. So this is going to be in the back end, what account is going to be authorized to run the code. So if you're selecting, if you don't want your users to have to log in when they're accessing the web app, then you can just select the execute as. So this will allow the script to execute as your main account. And also, if you do have shared files, then within the script, you don't have to worry about getting access to it. So if the user is executing the app as their own account, and if your app script is looking to access a file that they don't have permissions to, then you're going to run into some permissions errors. So there's a few things to consider when you're determining who you're executing the app as. Also, who is authorized to view the app. So if you select only yourself, you're the only one that can go to the web URL. There's also the anyone with a Google account. So that means that anyone that's logged into their Google account is going to be able to access this web URL. And if you select anyone, that's just open. They don't have to be logged into their Google account in order to access the content within your web URL. If you're using an organizational account, you're going to have another option here to allow anyone within the organization. So I'm going to just keep this as only myself. And this is, of course, just for testing purposes. And once you're ready, just hit deploy. You get returned back. So you get the deployment ID. So each one has a unique ID, so you can copy that. And if you do need the deployment ID in any way within scripts, and also notice that that ID is also going to be the one that's generated and used within the URL. So the web app does get a URL that you can use. There's going to be a separate one for testing and executable. This is the executable one, and the easiest way to tell which one is executable one and which one is dev, just look at the last characters here within the URL, and if it's exec, that means it's the executable one. So I've copied my web URL, and I can go over to my browser, paste it in, and we get the parameters that are sent and passed. So if I add in something like ID 100, we're going to see that we get a parameter of ID 100. We get the query string ID 100, parameter ID 100 within an object format. So if you're expecting more than one ID value being passed in, so if you have ID and then ID 500, you can use that as well. So we've got it within the query string. The parameters ID is going to be represented by an array. So that's the plural parameters. And if you just have parameter, it's just going to pick up the first value of ID. So depending on which one you want to use, you can select from typically parameters or parameter in order to get the parameters of the content within the URL. So that's how you can get that information. There's also a post, a do post, and this one is going to actually be returning back and only using a post method. So it's a little bit more complicated, and it's typically used when you're submitting forms or when you're submitting content to this URL. And you can get and pass the parameters into the web app, just as we saw with the do get, and it's going to pick up all of the post data. So you can get different types of post data if you're passing files and so on. Post is a little bit more flexible than get. It allows you to pass more information in a more secured format. So that's really the big difference between the two. And as mentioned, you can have two different endpoints to the web app, where you can have one that any web browser can go to and see, and then on the other side you can have a post where it can only be accessed using the post method. Also something to keep in mind as well, that if you do set this, and if you are connecting and posting data to this endpoint using web app URL, then you got to keep in mind that you've got to set the permissions. If you've set the permissions when you're deploying it as to anyone that can access it, that's the one that you don't need any login for your access to the URL. If you do need login to the URL, you're going to have to run the OAuth in order to authorize your Google account, and then that way it can connect to this URL. So it's a little bit more complicated if you do it that way, but both are available for you. And once you've created your web app, you can see the different deployments that you have under it, under the Manage Deployments. So it gives you information about the URL. You can see where you're executing. You can make updates to it as well. There's also the library, and let other people or groups use this project as a library, and you can share that with them as a library. There's also another thing to consider when you are using the dev version. It's only people that have shared access that are going to be able to see the web dev app URL. So when we go to the test deployments, again, we do see the same executable, and this is actually going to be the dev value for the executable, so you can copy that. The extension here is /dev, and the dev is exactly for that, for development purposes. So you can also update the HTML. So if we were to update that HTML, and I'll just update it and create some h1 tags. So now I've changed my code. If I go out to the developer version, we see the updated version of the code running. So of course you can use this for while you're developing the code to test and debug. And then once you've completed the version, you need to redeploy it. Otherwise the executable, it's not going to change until you've redeployed it. So once you're ready to select and redeploy it, just select new deployment, and I'll just call it V2. Select your parameters, who's going to execute the app, and then you can deploy the web app. And now the executable will have the changes that we just updated within the code. There's also different overviews as well, so you can see the users to it. There's also the executions on it, so you see the different executions where we've run, and project settings. And then under the manage deployments, you can see there's different deployments. So if we want to revert back to a previous version, we can redeploy that previous version. And now if I go to the executable, I'm going to be back to my previous version. The dev is still going to be running the dev code. So that gives you the ability that if you do launch an application, the executable, but there are some issues and errors, then you can always revert back to a previous version under the managed deployments. So it gets under the archived, it's going to list you out all of the different previous deployments that you have, and then this way you can switch between them if needed and if necessary. And that's why it's also important to have a good description, so that if you do need to switch between the different versions, you can easily read the descriptions as you've got more archive stuff and update the deployment information. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at other triggers, and these are the installable triggers that are available within AppScript. So just like the simple triggers that we've seen in the previous lessons, installable triggers lets the AppScript function run automatically depending on the certain event. So let's create a few functions, and we're going to run these functions on a set time period. So selecting a document that we want to maybe track some information into. So using the document app, and we'll open by ID. And we'll grab the ID of the document that we want to use, and then get the body, and then we'll log some content into the body. So going into the drive, select the same one that we had before, that UI tester that we were using. So it doesn't matter because this is just for testing purposes. So let's set up an ID and log the ID information. So we want to select the doc, and then with the doc, let's just append a paragraph. And within the paragraph, we'll append a date value. And the value that we're going to be using is from the date object. So coming from the JavaScript date object. And then we do need to force this into a string value. And let's append the paragraph whenever this function runs. So let's try it and just make sure that things are working properly. And I'll also remove out that existing content. We'll review the permissions, make sure that we do have permissions to access the document, and allow permissions, and then go back into the document, and we'll just make sure that we've actually tracked some information in there. And let's try to run it one more time. And I'll log out within the log. Let's just do some quick debugging and troubleshooting just to make sure that we do have the doc object. And I'm actually running the wrong function, so that's why we're coming across that issue. So let's see, we did get the logged out date into the document that we've selected. So we want to set this up to automatically run. Installable triggers, so they're more flexible than the simple triggers, as we can call any function. They do also require the authorization in order to run. So we can set them up on time-driven, so different clock events, as well as we can have them controlled programmatically by other triggers and so on. So installable triggers are a really good way to automate your Google scripts to run on certain time periods. So within here, and also just keep a note as well that there are some restrictions, so they don't run on a file that's opened as a read-only mode. Script executions requests do not cause triggers to run, so the API requests aren't going to cause them to run. Installable triggers always run under the account, the person who created them. So this is account-based that the triggers will run on. And a given account can see triggers installed from the second account, even though the first account can't activate those triggers. And you can see that within the triggers. So going over to the left-hand side, the menu, you can open up all of the triggers for this project. Right now, we don't have any triggers. And then also installable triggers are subject to the AppScript trigger quota. So there are some quota limits that you have to be mindful of. So things like the calendar events, there's a certain amount per day. You can create 250 documents. You can convert 2,000 files. So there's a number of limits, and those limits are available under the guides, services, quotas. So this will give you a better idea of what your limits are for the Google Apps script. And they are fairly good, so they do provide you quite a bit that you can do. So with the G Suite Free Edition, G Suite Business, and the Consumer Edition. So they're all going to have different limits. So keep that in mind when you are creating your scripts and running these scripts, especially on the triggers, because you do have a possibility to run fairly often the triggers. So there are a number of ways to set the triggers. So we've opened up the triggers menu here, and we see all the current triggers. So let's go ahead and we'll add a trigger. So within the trigger dashboard, and I'll make the screen slightly smaller so that it's all on the one page, and then I'll make it bigger again for the code. So first option that we have is to choose a function that we want to run. So from the drop down, we got all of the functions that are available within the current script that we're setting the trigger on. So I'm going to go ahead and select the fun one, choose which deployment should run. So we can select the different deployments. So if we have multiple versions, we can just run on a particular deployment, or we can select whatever the head one is that currently is active. So that's the one that we want to use in this case. We select the event source. So we have a choice where we can set it up as time-driven or calendar-driven, and that's going to affect the parameters below. So first let's go through the time-driven. So the time-driven, we can select the time-based trigger. So we can select it on a specific date and time, and that's going to ask us for a calendar value. We can set it up on a minutes timer, so then we set the interval in minutes. There's also an hourly timer, so if we're setting an interval per hour. There's a day time, so what time of day that we want to run this trigger on. Weekly timer, and that's going to give us a couple more parameters, so we can select the time, the day of the week, and then we select the time. We can select a month trigger, so when it runs, so the date of the month, and then we also have to select a time that we want it to run. So those are our options for the time-driven triggers. There's also the calendar-driven one. So the calendar, enter calendar details, so and then the calendar is owned. So this can get triggered from a calendar event source, from the My Calendar, and then we can trigger off these various events. Most of the time, we are setting up time-driven triggers, so we'll walk you through how to set this up. So you select the time-driven trigger. I'm going to do it on a minutes timer, and we can set it to every minute. And then this is also something that you should set where if the trigger fails, which means that if the function fails for whatever reason, or if the trigger fails, you've hit a quota or it doesn't run properly, when do you want to get notified? So oftentimes I will select notify me immediately because I'd rather know right away if I set up the trigger. You can also set it to notify you hourly. So if you've got a lot of scripts running and you want to check every hour, and there's also daily and there's weekly. So I'm going to set it up at notify me immediately, and this will send an email to the account that's creating the trigger. So every trigger is created by an account, and that's the account that's also going to be running the script. So now let's go back to our editor, and it's going to be running the script. Let's make the screen larger again so we can see the code better. And we'll go back into our sheet, and let's check the triggers. So we see that the trigger is added, and we've got last run. So there's no last run. There's the deployment. So it gives you a quick overview. And if you have a number of triggers running, you're going to have all of these triggers that have run. You can also add in filters for the view. So if you want it to filter it on a particular function, a trigger ID, if you've got multiple triggers, event type, or owned by me. So you can filter when the triggers get run. Let's go back and forth. And we see that the trigger ran. So it gives us the when it was last run and if there's any errors with the trigger. So it looked like it worked okay. Let's go back into the script, and we see that in fact it did run, and we've got the code added to the page. So that's how you can set up the triggers, and you can also set up a trigger using the application. So programmatically, like with the script, you can set up a trigger as well. And if we want to create a time-driven trigger, and this is also good if you want to have a trigger that actually gets removed. So if you've got this hourly or minute by minute trigger and you want it to run for 60 minutes, then you can use script in order to remove the trigger. And you can also use script to add a trigger. So let's add trigger. And so this script, what it's going to do is it's going to add the trigger. So the trigger is based on the script app. And we select the new trigger. And then we have to select the function. So this is the function name. This is the function that's called whenever the trigger runs. So I'm going to create another function, and I'll call it fun2. And I'll do something different in fun2, where the value is going to be, and we'll just write out hello world. And then we'll also append within the doc, we can append a horizontal rule. So that way we can distinguish between the two functions. So we set up the trigger, and from the trigger, we've got a few options there for the new trigger. So we can set it up as a time-based. We can also set from document, from form, from spreadsheet, from user calendar. So we've got some options there as we're the source of the trigger. And as we'll set up a time-based, we're going to set up another time-based using the code. So when do we want this to run? If we want it to run every minute, every hour, we'll set it up to every minute. And then this is also going to require, so for the every minutes, just as we had within the selection when we were setting up the trigger, and if we do time-driven minutes, and if we do every minute, we've got that option there for setting it up on a particular minute. And then lastly, let's create this. And that will create the new trigger. So let's run the add trigger and see what happens. So we need to accept the permissions in order to add the trigger, as this is going to be another service that we're going to be implementing to the script to run. So it's going to allow us to add the trigger. So we have a problem here with parameters. So they don't match the signature for the script trigger. So we need to specify the script app and the trigger property. And this is requiring every how many minutes we want. So if we're actually setting a day of the week, we can use the weekdays. So there's only a weekday enum. And if we're looking for minutes or hours, this is expecting a numeric value. So we're going to run it every minute. So let's try that one more time. Run. And now we've entered in the parameter. And if we go over to the triggers, we're going to see that we've run that initial trigger. We've got another time-based trigger that's sitting there. And if we select that trigger that we just created, we've pre-filled the function that we're using, the head, time-driven, minutes, and it's running every minute. So that's the interval, that's the numeric interval that we needed. And then there's also the failure notifications. So you can set all of this information from the script, and the trigger hasn't run yet. And of course, you can see the trigger is running. So this is just a regular trigger, just like any other trigger. And so we also have an option if we want to delete the triggers. So let's loop through all of the triggers. And we'll just call this update triggers function. And I got too many G's in there. So let's select all of the triggers. And using the script app, we want to get the project triggers. So we've got various triggers that we can select from. So we can get the script triggers, users triggers, and in this case we want to get the project triggers. So this is going to list out all of the triggers that are for the project. And let's log this into the log first so that we can see the object that we're picking up. So update triggers, run. And we've got the two triggers that we know that are set for this current project. So that means that we can also loop through them. So the triggers going through each, and then let's set that. So we'll loop through each one of them. And let's, in the log, we're going to list out the trigger ID. So let's get the unique ID. So we can get all of this information, so the different event types, handler function, and the ID. So we'll log the ID, and then also within the log, let's get the event type as well. And also within the log, we'll get the other one there, the handler function, so that we can track it according to the handler function. And this is, depending on how you want to pick up your trigger, you need to select the right trigger that you want to remove. So these are some of the parameters that you can use in order within an if condition to see if you want to remove it. So let's run through the update triggers, and we'll check out the output that we've got within the execution log. So this is going to be looping through the triggers that we currently have on the project. It's going to be outputting our event unique ID. So it's going to be the trigger ID. There's the event type and the event handler function. So first we're looping through. We're getting all of the triggers. We're getting the ID of the trigger. Then we're getting the event type. So it's on a clock type. And then we're going to get the get handler function. So this is returning back a string value. So that allows us to identify the particular trigger that we want to use, or particular function that we want to remove. So now that we've got that information, as we loop through, we can check to see if the handler function is equal to whatever function we want to remove. And if it is, then whatever that current trigger is, we can delete a trigger. So using the script app method, we've got an option to delete trigger method, and then we need to specify the trigger object in here, and so that will allow us to remove out the trigger with the function of fun1. And how about we remove out, or fun2, but how about we remove out fun1? So let's run through there, and we know that the fun1 has been running. So we've got the hello world was also running. Let's run that one more time to update the triggers, and then we'll check all of the triggers that we currently have. And at that point, we should have removed out one of the triggers. So let's go over, while it's executing, let's go over to the trigger. So we see we've got some data here on the triggers that we have. We've got it that it's run. You can get project details. You can get executions of the trigger. So this is going to give you more information about the trigger, how many times it's ran, the duration, the status. So you can get more details about the triggers under the filters. And this is just in general how many of the triggers and how many functions. This is project information in general under the executions. So now when we go back into the triggers, we've actually removed out the trigger using the code. So we selected the trigger and we removed the trigger. And also if we wanted to remove out the one with fun2, so let's go ahead and remove that so we don't have any triggers running afterwards. So going back into the triggers, and all of the triggers have now been removed. We can still see the log of them under the executions. So this will allow you to find out if some of your scripts have run, and you can get more details under the executions of the triggers. So that's how you can create and generate triggers either manually or using code, and then also how you can remove them from your script applications.